Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Wang, and I'm the CEO, co-founder of Searchlight. We have a great panel and conversation in store for you today around 5 insights into modern recruiting from eBay and Greenhouse. We have Rick Iverson, the head of global recruiting at eBay, and John Strauss, co-founder, president of Greenhouse. Before we jump into it, we have a few housekeeping items, a word from our sponsors. Today's webinar is brought to you by Searchlight and Greenhouse. Searchlight is the quality of hire platform that gives companies the speed and analytics they need to make the best hires. We align hiring teams upfront on their success criteria and then assess talent down funnel to improve hiring decisions. We take a scientific, software-driven approach to unlock insights on candidates' soft skills, culture add, and strengths. Searchlight makes it possible to understand a hire's competencies from day one, leading to stronger teams and higher retention. Greenhouse Software is the fastest growing provider of enterprise talent acquisition software. Thousands of the smartest and most successful companies like HubSpot, Cisco Meraki, JD Power, and Warby Parker use Greenhouse's intelligent guidance to design and automate all aspects of hiring throughout their organizations, helping them compete and win for top talent. Greenhouse has won numerous awards, including #1 Best Place to Work by Glassdoor, Forbes Cloud 100, and Talent Acquisition Frontrunner Leader by Software Advice. To learn more, visit greenhouse.io. A few notes about today's webinar. This presentation will be recorded and shared with all attendees and registrants. We want to make sure this conversation is as interactive as possible, so please submit questions for our panelists, and we'll make every effort to save time at the conclusion of our webinar to get to them. And finally, once the thought leadership portion of our webinar concludes, you'll have the chance to stick around and see a brief demo of Searchlight with its integration with Greenhouse and learn how our technology can help you implement some of the best practices on modern recruiting that we're going to talk about today. Now, without further delay, I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves. Rick, let's start with you.
Hi, thanks, Carrie. Thanks for having me. It's really cool to be part of these kind of things. I love it. I love to talk about recruiting and tools and process. So this is great. Thank you. I'm Rick Iverson. I'm the global head of recruiting at eBay. I have recently just moved over from a similar role at Rakuten, and I'm just really happy to be here and talk recruiting.
John?
Hi there, I'm John Strauss, co-founder and president of Greenhouse. And again, Carrie, thanks for having me on. I love doing these things. Getting to nerd out and talk about recruiting with folks is pretty much my job description. So yeah, we started the company almost 9 years ago now, and have gotten fortunate to work with all sorts of different companies and see all sorts of different people trying to figure out recruiting in this world.
Awesome. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you both today. It's been super fun every time we've chatted, so glad to share these learnings with the world. So let's jump into it. I want to start off with a topic that I know is dear to both of you, and that is relationship-driven recruiting and how it can help organizations build active talent pools. So Rick, as you mentioned, you just moved to eBay, you just changed jobs. So can you start us off by speaking a little bit about your experience and the impact that relationship building had in your decision to take on this new role?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple facets to it actually, because there was a direct relationship aspect in the process where somebody who I had interacted with previously in a recruiting setting ended up being on the interview panel at eBay. And I had developed a long-standing relationship with this person, and when I saw them appear on the roster for the interview, it was a relief and super cool, but also, sorry about the ringing in the background. Also, really just spoke to, I was relieved that I had developed a good relationship with this person in general. And then in terms of looking at eBay and as a destination for me, the opportunity at eBay on a global fashion to really help the company evolve with their new CEO, who is really moving forward with the mission of reinventing our tech. I just saw it as a great opportunity to sort of put my philosophy and game plan into play in a really, really cool environment, high tech environment, iconic brand. So it was not a hard decision. Ultimately, the only part of it that was a little bit tricky and maybe caused me to pause for a minute is the circumstances and the climate, and thinking about moving companies and making a big career change in the midst of a pandemic definitely was something I had to really think long and hard about, but it ended up working out in a really positive way.
So, Rick, it's so great to hear that even in the middle of this pandemic, that relationship-driven recruiting can still happen, and it was a big part of your move. And John, you've built one of the leading recruiting tools on the market today. And can you speak about your experience with relationship recruiting and what impact it's had as you think about the building the talent tech and tooling?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's this wide range of tactics that folks take as they try to figure out how am I going to attract candidates, how am I going to get people to apply, how am I going to go find people. And there's this kind of continuum from like the short-term stuff where it's like, post a job ad and get active candidates tomorrow. And that can be really good. You can like go find active candidates. You can, but it can be very expensive. You can go and like find strangers on LinkedIn and send a bunch of in-mails, and all of that like allows you to target, but it can be very expensive and very time consuming. The opposite of that, or on the other end of the spectrum, is would say relationship recruiting, where you say, we're going to build relationships up front that may not pay off immediately. And it could take lots of different things. It could be people who've applied previously, I'm going to nurture. It could be people I've met at university who I'm waiting for them to graduate. It could even be your own employees who you're nurturing for their next role. It could be referrals. And so I think what we see is that the companies who are kind of becoming more mature and getting more strategic are realizing, I can't start every search from scratch. I can't just do the short term, buy a job ad or bang away on LinkedIn. I've got to start building these relationships. And so they're investing more in how do I build these databases of past applicants and employees and students and all these different things. So when I open a new role, I've got some place to start. And to Rick's story, obviously, like it's hard to take a new job, especially in this world where you can't go meet somebody in person. It really feels like a big leap. And so the idea that you have a relationship with somebody, it's part of a longer term conversation, helps somebody get over the hurdle of like leaving a safe job and going to a place that you're not sure about.
So to both of you, now that the world has shifted to distributed remote recruiting, what are strategies and tactics that talent teams can use to still perform relationship-driven recruiting without those face-to-face meetings?
You know, I think that whether you're, remote or not, the bulk of recruiting is not face to face with somebody in an office setting. You interact with the hiring managers in a face to face fashion, and that part of it not being available to recruiters right now, I think, is a bit of a challenge. You don't have the opportunity to swing by the VP of Engineering's desk and have a chat. And that's powerful stuff. But in general, the practice of recruiting takes place virtually, and it takes place across the world. And it's really all the more reason, in this environment in particular, where building talent pools and having relationships. I mean, for me, there's that is recruiting. That is what recruiting is. It's building a relationship with somebody, and ultimately there's an intersection where it just makes sense for them to come and join your company. And that's what the recruiting is and is all about. And then the speed and the cadence of it is really just down to the depth of your pools. You're as fast as the talent you have access to, and to John's point, when you're starting from scratch every single time you open a search, you are at a massive disadvantage to those companies who aren't. And to take it a step further, there's probably a lot of hires that happen that nobody ever knew that there was a candidate who took the job was even on the market because of relationships. It just happens before anything even gets, is open to the public. So I think that, really being disciplined around this practice now more than ever is mission critical. but I also think that for me, this is recruiting, and I think it's important to emphasize that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, I'd echo the same thing. I think the only thing I'd add is it's simply about it. You have to be really intentional. Like in this moment, I think it's so different. Like so many things that used to just be depending on like, oh, I could just wander over to somebody's desk and check in with them. How's it going? Like none of that stuff's possible anymore. And so if you say, hey, I want to do relationship driven recruiting, like you got to be that much more intentional about it and say, this is what I want to accomplish. I'm going to go, you can still do it. To Rick's point, like a lot of the relationships were never built in person anyhow. A lot of stuff was remote or over the phone anyhow. So it should still be possible.
So it sounds like relationship-based recruiting requires a process-centric and standardized recruiting practice. These two things have been perennial topics for talent teams. And arguably, this approach is now more important than ever in ensuring that recruiters make the best business decisions and candidates feel comfortable making big changes in their career. So Rick, how do you think about standardizing the candidate experience? And what do you see as its main benefits, as well as the major risks of not implementing this approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, not really important, mission critical to be systematized and to be in a system that's a center of truth for the whole organization. Because at a high level, if you don't, then every pocket of every place that's doing hiring is basically doing it differently. And there's no vision into what's happening. There's not a vision into the funnel. There's not even a vision into how you're scheduling the interviews. And without that, the candidate experience is going to be hit and miss. And some groups are going to do it really well, and some groups are going to do it poorly. And that being erratic really impacts the candidate experience, but also the internal client experience is not necessarily a good one if you're outside of a systematized non-process environment. The internal people interviewing who are taking the time to go through this too feel unorganized, they're unprepared, and so they're not really sure what they're talking to the candidate about. Bring this all together into a center of truth, creating a collective conscience that everybody is working from, and a process that is crisp and well thought out is everything to a candidate. And it's if you're talking global, then it's just about internationalizing and localizing that no matter where you walk in eBay, there's elements of the process that are the same in Beijing or New York or San Francisco, but then it's localized to whatever geography that you're in, depending upon certain other aspects of it. So I think when you have that, you really set yourself up for a great candidate experience. And when you don't, it's like herding cats, and it's really difficult.
So I'm hearing for sure aligning the hiring team super important to ensure that standardized candidate experience. And now that we're remote, we have to be more thoughtful. We can't, stop by someone's office. John, I'm curious to get your take. What can talent teams do to build stronger relationships between recruiters and hiring managers to enable a standardized recruiting process?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times what's happened is that the hiring manager recruiters don't actually understand what each other is supposed to do. They haven't agreed on what their roles and responsibilities are. And so everybody ends up like kind of pointing fingers at each other and getting mad. And so I say, like, where do you start? Is you got to start with a kickoff meeting. You got to start with, say, like, you get together and say, what are we trying to hire for here? Why? What's the business need? How will we know we found the person? Where are we likely to find that person? How are we going to interview them? If you're not willing to have that meeting, if the hiring manager says, I'm not willing to do that, just send me some candidates, you got to say no and say, like, it's not going to work. Exactly. And so you got to line up front on that plan. And once you say, hey, we're now on the same page of what we're looking for, then from the recruiter, you have to provide transparency and say, hey, I'm going to give you updates regularly. Here's how this role is going. Here's the key candidates. Here's what I need you to do. Sounds very simple, but like most teams don't do that, right? We encounter teams all the time that they don't have that. And so the hiring manager is feeling all this urgency. I need to get a button seat. Let's go. And I don't know what's happening. So I'm losing confidence. So I start panicking. And then you start going downhill and it becomes kind of a doom loop. So I say start by aligning on the plan. Second is like provide transparency. And then ultimately where you get to is you start to realize the expectations of the role. We call it at Greenhouse, we call them the talent makers, the kind of the hiring manager or business leader who's super interested in getting great talent, but they're not the recruiter. And they're saying like, I'm really interested, but like, I'm not the recruiter. It's not my job. It's like, yes, but you do have a job here. And so the way we think about it is like, you've got 3 jobs. You're going to be a talent magnet. You as the leader have to step up and like become somebody who people want to work for. Whether it's the way you interview, the way you attract people, the way you close offers. Number 2 is you have to be a talent leader. You have to set a vision and culture like within your company. So you're the one who have to hold people accountable for filling out scorecards and showing up to interviews. That's not the recruiter's job, that's your job. And 3 is you have to be a good partner to the recruiter and you have to play the game and give them what they need. Overall, we see that there's a big gap there. We see more and more CEOs and head of engineering and head of sales who realize their success is entirely dependent on them recruiting well, but they're not sure what they're supposed to do. And so I think that's where hiring managers and recruiters got to come together and realize we have different roles to play, but they're very equally dependent on each other.
Well, and you know, and that's where, again, being in a system and intake, right? Carrie, you and I have talked about this. It's my happy place. It starts with intake, and it starts with, as deep as org analysis. And if this is a backfill, do we need to backfill this position even, and why? And then building a job description, and then building an interview panel that's based on, job assignments that tie back to the job description, which, if you want to talk about climate, and an important thing in today's climate, it is making sure that you're running an inclusive search. And you won't know that you're running an inclusive search until you, really work with your D&I team, and your job descriptions are standardized and your funnel is as wide open and inclusive as possible. And that starts with intake. But the comfort zone for the hiring manager is that gives them touch points to work from, and you're a collaborative partner that way. It's a consultative approach as opposed to a reactive one. And once you get into the consultative mode and you're kind of guiding the hiring manager through a very clear process, and you're sitting in a system that has a dashboard and it has the funnel, and everything's clear, hiring managers relax because they can see all of the moving parts, and everything that's happening within the search, and they can participate. They can go into the system, they can look at the inbound traffic. Meanwhile, the recruiting team is out there prospecting in the search. They're bringing candidates from the talent pools, they're converting them to prospects, from prospects to candidates, and it starts to flow. The other part of that's really important on the intake front, and not to be too long-winded, but I think a lot of companies, and eBay included, and Rakuten before, and we really improved on this at Rakuten a lot, is that they ultimately determine what the job is by live interview, instead of determining what the job is on the front end. And so you spin 8 to 10 live interviews, to figure out who you really want to hire, is a tremendous time sink, and ultimately a cost. It's very costly to move in that fashion, when you could have made the decision in 2, 3, 4 candidates that you live interviewed if the intake and the preparation was thorough on the front end. So there's a lot at stake. And that's why really being thoughtful, John, as you said, really being thoughtful and mindful, and the recruiters really getting side by side with the hiring manager is it's just the impact all the way down is, it really changes everything.
Well, and I think where it then completes is if you do that intake up front, you align on here's what we're looking for. You say, here's how we'll know which people can do the job. We align on here's the interview process we're going to run. We use the questions we're going to ask. We put a bunch of candidates through it. Then you get to that roundup huddle meeting at the end where you say, okay, we've got a couple of candidates, let's make a decision. And instead of it being whoever kind of talks loudest or whatever the boss says everyone agrees with, you're able to look and say, well, here are the 12 things that we said were important in this role.
Yeah.
So we can understand which candidates have those things and which don't. And now we're making this really data-informed decision. At which point people, like the light bulb goes on, they go, oh, so all that work we did up front on the intake meeting to align on what we're looking for, and then all those interviews where we made you fill out scorecards and interview in a very specific way, helped us make a much better decision at the end. Oh, we're definitely doing this going forward. And so that's what we typically see at companies is it starts with lots of people resist and say, well, we've been hiring people for years. Why do we need to do this structured interviewing? Why do I have to do all this work up front on a kickoff meeting? And then you do it and you realize, oh, wow, this is way better. And suddenly it picks up momentum. And everyone realizes this is a way easier way. It's way faster. You remove a lot of drama by making a lot of those decisions up front.
When you start to get the metrics too about, who's interviews, who says yes all the time, who says no all the time.
That's right.
And it's especially when you get into the scorecard aspect of it, and constructing that and having thoughtful interview assignments, the false positives and false negatives too, where you see a scorecard and you're reading it and it's thumbs down, but everything says yes.
Yeah.
And it's a great, great conversation piece to have within a decision-making roundtable around how come you said no? And it might be something really simple that the group can course correct on and say, oh, no, I talked to the person and they actually this, that, and this, and then that clears it up. And you end up moving forward potentially with a good hire that you may have passed on otherwise. I think another part of it too, that's a little bit sensitive, and I think it takes some maturity and sophistication, but is also understanding from the get-go with your panel and the hiring manager that you don't necessarily have to have consensus, and that it's actually okay if some people are not 100% on board with the hire. But they understand why you would hire the person because you've run a really thorough process. So it just gets deep. And the reason that this doesn't happen a lot of times is because you don't have the ability to organize in this fashion. And so the job requisition gets to the recruiter and it's taken a minute for it to be approved, and there is no intake, and the hiring manager has been waiting, and so everybody just sprints. And I think that's where what happens in a lot of places pretty regularly. And because the argument is out there, I can hear it. Hey, that's nice, Rick, but we need to get these positions filled, and we have to do it in a certain period of time, and we don't necessarily have time to do this. And that's really true. If you don't take the time to set the stage and do the search right to begin with, then yeah, you're right. You don't have time because you don't have any candidates and you don't have time to find them. But if you're thorough from the beginning, then you control the time. And that's hard to digest, I think. But that's, I think when you unlock that with recruiting teams, it really changes the whole cadence of how you go about recruiting and hiring.
Two main things I'm hearing throughout this discussion around intake. One is to slow down to speed up.
Yep.
Right. If you're actually rushing to get to that interview, you're going to spend way more time interviewing. If only you had just slowed down in the beginning to define that success criteria. The second theme I'm hearing is the elevation of the recruiter to be really a consultative talent partner. Only by defining that success criteria up front can we have really effective and objective debriefs. And if there's something that's off, to be able to have those thoughtful conversations to figure out why. So sounds like the intake piece is more critical than ever. So another part that's really important for recruiting teams, though, is actually onboarding, right? You also need to recruit new employees to set them up for success. I would love to dive into this and see how eBay and Greenhouse think about this critical part of the employee lifecycle. John, can you speak a little bit to how you and Greenhouse think about onboarding?
Sure. I mean, and this is one where it's interesting. I think, as Rick mentioned earlier, you say, what's changed with COVID? Everybody's working from home. How is recruiting different? In some ways, it's like, well, it's a lot similar. We're doing a lot of the same things. Some more meetings are on Zoom than used to be. Onboarding, I would argue, has been changed a lot more. Is that if we think about what's happening when you're a new employee, sure, there's the logistics part of getting a computer and a desk and a phone, and getting on payroll and filling out paperwork and stuff. But there's all this other stuff that's also happening typically, where it's like, how do you become a part of the community of the company? How do you make friends? How do you learn like the social norms of the company? How do you learn the culture of the company? All of that stuff typically happens by like, go sit at your desk next to your teammates and you'll figure it out. And it kind of happens through osmosis. And you don't worry about somebody like socially meeting other people. You don't worry about them being isolated because they sit next to everybody. There's all that just kind of happens naturally. And now in this world, where everybody's on Zoom, you can't depend on any of that happening. And so I think what we're seeing is a greater focus of companies who are scrambling and realizing, well, onboarding isn't just about like send them a computer before their first day so they can be on Zoom on day one. It's like, how do I intentionally, purposefully set up interactions so they meet all the people they need to go meet? So they learn how the company works. They learn how do you get stuff done in this company, because so much that you can't do. And so so I think what we're seeing is more companies are getting much more intentional about onboarding and saying this isn't just like afterthought to recruiting. This is super core to the whole employee experience. And we're seeing also a lot of people saying, listen, I used to spend a lot of money on onboarding. I'd fly people around the world and buy them all this swag, all this stuff. And like, we're not doing any of that anymore. And so like, we're really nervous about our employee experience and how do we get people off on the right foot. And so I think that's what we're seeing. And what we do through our Greenhouse onboarding product is really helping people choreograph that whole experience from before they even start on the first day, all the way through the first couple of months to ensure they get off on the right foot.
I mean,
Yeah.
how it directly ties to recruiting is if you don't set someone up for success and then they leave, well, you have to backfill that role, right? So all that time and effort spent making that hire, doesn't have a long-term lifetime value, right? Greenhouse, we've spoken a lot about the employee lifetime value. Rick, I'm curious to hear how you approach this. Has eBay changed the way that it's approached onboarding in this new remote first world?
Yeah, I mean, eBay, I have to give eBay huge, huge credit. They are fantastic. We are fantastic now. My experience, my onboarding experience was A+. And it was the little things, like they had my boss Stephanie had a deck prepared for me. I actually had a specific person who shepherded me through my first 30 days, and was basically, we had touch bases a couple times a week, and she set up meetings for me. She sort of gave me a little bit of insight into navigating this and navigating that and the history. And so it was very well planned and thought out, right down to the swag that actually did arrive at my doorstep, which was really cool. I would argue that swag is even more fun to receive remotely. It's nice. It's nice when a package goes up at your door and it's some cool things that you weren't expecting. But there was an incredible amount of effort that went into coordinating all of that, and that is a whole nother level of sort of cohesion that needs to take place between recruiting and at eBay we have an actual onboarding team, and the handoff from recruiting to onboarding, I think that we do a really good job between the two groups. And our onboarding team does exceptional work. Where recruiting comes in, and I think this is something that we're working on. I do feel it's important for the recruiter to maintain connection with the candidate, and a lot of times, when the candidate starts, the recruiter continuing to maintain a little bit of that connection, I think, is an important thing, especially virtually. And is something that it's just somebody that the candidate knows that they can turn to, and get questions answered and things like that through the process. So I think some of that is always work in progress, but at eBay, we've done an exceptional job with our onboarding team is just great. And the thought that went into it was, with my situation and in general, is really top notch.
I think ultimately what we'll see is onboarding and recruiting, like the planning process will actually get merged. So the intake meeting we were talking about earlier, you end up also planning onboarding at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you're saying, hey, here's what we're looking for in this role, here's what they're going to do, another natural question is like, what's their 30, 60, 90-day plan? And you should be able to figure that out up front. And that should be in that initial kickoff meeting. And then that should be shared with the new hire before they even walk in the door. You should say, hey, here's what's going to happen. Here's your new job. Here's what your 36 90-day plan is. And so I think more and more we're going to realize like these aren't two separate functions. Like this is all can be planned once. It's only one experience for the candidate. They don't notice that they're moving from the recruiting team to the HR team. To them, they're just dealing with the company. And so I think over time, these are going to get more and more merged.
Yeah.
I've spoken to many talent leaders and asked them, well, what does a good kickoff look like? And one question that surfaced a lot is, instead of asking hiring managers, well, what does this new hire look like? Really, the question is, well, what business impact do you want this new hire to have, right? So it focuses in, okay, what do you want them to accomplish? And then naturally, what do you want them to accomplish in the first 30, 60, 90 days? And then there you have it. You have your onboarding plan. It's an impact plan, really, to help close a great talent.
Yeah, it's very clarifying to start from that question, right?
Yeah.
So, I would contend that starts when you stage the job in intake, when you decide that you're going to recruit people based on the career path that you can put them on by them coming to your company. I think that it actually starts there, and how you go about bringing people in. And if you do it based on, hey, we're reaching out to you because we think based on what you're doing now, you coming to eBay, in my case, is the best move for your career. And let's walk you through the journey of this job. And if you agree, that's the best possible reason to join a company. And that, really sets the stage for, a great onboarding and sort of indoctrination process of getting people in the mix. If it's from the place of, wow, man, this is the exact career path I want. Like, I felt that way. I felt like this is the great next step in my career. And it was presented to me that way. And I went through the process that way. And it has been exactly that since I've arrived. And that's how I think about it. Not money or other things, but it's really like, this is a great step forward for me, and I would do it no matter what the circumstances.
So with that, I mean, let's just spend 1 second to talk about also what can go wrong, because retention is also top of mind, right? You want to present people with that career path, but now that you can't see people in person, attrition is more top of mind. So what can we do to address attrition, and what should a talent organization specifically do proactively to account for and decrease attrition?
You may take that one first.
Go for it.
It goes back to intake. It really does. And why are you hiring this person to begin with? And then when you talk about attrition, I think it's being really mindful of, if you are going to backfill this position, why? And is it role for role? Is that the exchange that we're talking about? Or is there somewhere else in the org that would make more sense to backfill with this opening? Are there people within the team who we should look at promoting? And now more than ever, and going forward, from a D&I perspective, I think that there needs to be real thought put into the internal organization and the balance of the team, and what does that look like, and where should we go to bring in the next person into this role, and are we willing to skill somebody up who has potential but who maybe needs a little bit more from us into this, and I just think it boils down to being mindful around how you're going to proceed when attrition takes place, and being mindful of how you hire to begin with, so that you can keep attrition to a minimum. But there is going to be attrition for a lot of reasons, and it's just how do you react to it? Are you prepared for it? And I do think it's a case-by-case thing when it comes to backfilling jobs, if you have to. And again, I think it's why you're hiring to begin with really dictates how much attrition that you'll have.
Yeah, I guess I'd take a different angle. I think, our default assumption is always that, like, all of our employees, if they went out and interviewed, could probably find offers at other companies. They could probably find offers for more money somewhere else. And so we have to create reasons every day for them to stay. And the truth is, if you dig in with each person, like, people value really different things. Some people want career growth. Some people want an inspiring mission. Some people, it's about the community of people they're part of. Like, it's all different stuff. And so so at some level, each manager has to figure out, like, what motivates each person and how do you make sure you can do that for them. The other piece that, we think a lot about too is that some attrition is like short-term bad and long-term good. So like, we've had a place where, like, there's parts of our org where people grow up, they get really good, they become managers, and they go off and become like leaders and get a big promotion at some other company. And in the short term, you're like, oh no, that person's awesome, I don't want them to leave, that's terrible. But in the long term, what's happening is we're showing that, like, this is a place you can build your career. And Greenhouse is a really great place to be from. And that's actually great, because now when I go out and recruit and they say, well, why should I come here? I'm like, because you could look at the last 6 people who came here. You get promoted, you learn a lot, you build your career, you actually get a bigger job on the next one down. And so at some level, like, our employees aren't our property. They're not going to be here forever. We don't own them. At some point, people are going to want to move on. And at some level, that's okay. Obviously, I want people to stay. But if they go on and do some great thing somewhere else, that's good for them, and that's actually good for us too. And so it's very painful in the short term when people who you just think are amazing leave, and you're like, no, don't leave. But also what you're realizing is, like, sometimes they come back, and you're building a reputation for, like, this is a good place to be from.
I've heard from many people leaders, they call this the boomerang employee, and there's so much pride to that, right?
Yeah.
To say, at my company, I was able to give and develop this talent so they could go somewhere else and further develop, but then ultimately that this home was still some place that they wanted to come back to.
Yeah.
So certainly that's a mark of achievement
or they come back and tell everyone,
company.
they come back and tell everyone, hey, I saw it out there, it's terrible, stay here, it's much better. I'm like, well, that's nice too.
Well, I want to talk about also one thing that I know you're both very excited about, and Rick even brought it up earlier today, which is the idea of creating a single source of truth in recruiting within an organization. So can you both talk a little bit more about why you believe this kind of what you believe this kind of approach can enable, and then the kind of tech that's necessary to make it happen?
You want to take that first, John?
Sure. I mean, I guess the self-serving thing would be to say, like, well, obviously you should use Greenhouse. That was kind of the premise of how we built the company. But I think the answer that we tend to talk about is, if you don't have, like, a source of truth, right? If everybody's, like, living in their own spreadsheets and their own Post-it notes, it's really hard to know what's actually happening. And so you can't get to any kind of iteration and say, well, what if we did this differently? If you say, well, how, from a D&I perspective, how come we keep hiring way more men than women? What's happening? And the answer is, we don't know. We can't see what's happening. And so the thing that gets you there, where you say we're going to have, like, one clear sense of data, is ultimately that everybody lives in the same tool. You actually express your recruiting work in the tool. And so you're not having to do extra work. You're not, like, doing your recruiting over here and say, somebody has to remember to go write it down in the tool so we have good data. It's like, that'll never happen. Nobody will ever remember. And so it has to be a thing where everybody actually says, we're going to collaborate together in the tool. We have the expectation that whatever I see, the pipeline I see in the tool is true. That's where candidates actually are. And once the hiring manager knows to expect that, the recruiter then has to keep the data in good shape there. And once you kind of have that momentum that everybody has said, listen, we all agree we're going to do our recruiting, we're going to do our collaboration in this one place, now we're actually going to generate good data kind of as exhaust out of that process. And once you have that, now you're enabled to say, well, how can we be better? What can we do better next quarter? How do we improve our candidate experience? How do we improve our or mitigate bias throughout the interview process? But it all kind of comes down from, like, we're all going to decide together that we're going to work in the tool and create good data.
Yeah, and the transparency is everything, and it builds trust, and you have to be able to see exactly what's going on, and know where you're headed, and have a jump off place for hiring to work from, and if it's not contained within a modern system that's a center of truth, that, just like you said, John, the entrance to hiring is through the system, and that's the only way you can go. And if it's happening outside the system, it's not real. And that takes a minute for companies that aren't systematized to get used to. But then once they get used to it, everybody just feels so much more at ease and so much better. And like you said, John, it feeds off of itself. And so I think it's really important to go about it in a way that is, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and really build and get everybody used to operate. You can't just roll out everything at once. But I think once you are able to get everybody off of out of their silos and into one center of truth, everybody wins and everybody feels much more empowered. The other side of it too is it really is information, detail, and metrics that the business needs. And you become not just the center of truth for recruiting, but information that is really, really important and is sought after. Ultimately, that is a responsibility of the recruiting organization to provide.
This is a great segue into audience questions, because one of the questions someone posed was, what are the most important metrics and data to track in recruiting?
You wanted to go first, Sean, and then I can chime in on that.
Sure. I mean, different companies are going to look at it differently. There are a couple of things I always look at. I mean, one is the highest level of like, are we hitting the seats we're supposed to hit? Are we actually making the hires when we're supposed to? Are we being predictable? There's then a pack of metrics that people use as a proxy for candidate experience. So things like offer acceptance rate. Maybe you have a survey where you actually survey the candidates, but something that kind of totals up like, how are we treating folks? From a sourcing, sometimes people get into like time to hire, and that's kind of like, that can be important or not important depending on your context. Something that we look at Greenhouse, we talk about kind of top of funnel velocity. So it's not just like how many applicants you're getting, because that can be very noisy if you're just like getting lots of unqualified folks, but like how many people am I getting on a weekly basis who are good enough to phone screen? And that's kind of a measure of like sourcing effectiveness, is like, are we quickly getting those folks? Maybe I'll stop there, but could go for a while. Like, there's a whole other category of like, how do I measure the effectiveness of a recruiter? How do I report to my exec team every quarter? But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a funneled approach, and it is. But I think the one metric that's key, that I think transcends all recruiting organization, it's your offer acceptance rate. And understanding, if you get candidates to the final, and how are we getting acceptance at a certain percentage that's acceptable to the business, I think is a really, really key metric. But then, the time to hire metric is really important, because, that there's a few things in play there around, if this is going on and on and on and on, what's happening, and it's a catalyst for the recruiter to circle back. We're not hitting it. What's happening here, and ultimately, is this a hire we actually need to make? And I think that's a responsibility that we have to the business. I think that there's the number of hires that tracking, making sure that recruiters are hitting a certain number of hires that are necessary, that the business requires. Maybe there's a release or a deliverable in tech or something like that needs to be hit. So I do think that the metrics are more simple and basic, but then it's a constant refreshing of those numbers, and partnering with the business and partnering with the hiring managers with those numbers, to keep everybody, keep it real, and keep everybody on track.
That's actually the key point. I think rather than me obsessing over what's the exact right metric, and is it these 4 metrics or this other 5th metric, it's really more like, do you have a regular cadence with your key stakeholders?
Yeah.
Do you sit down with each recruiter every week or 2 weeks and review how they're doing? Do you sit down with your hiring manager every week and provide them transparency to how it's going? Do your exec team get a report every quarter? Does your board get a report every board meeting?
Yep.
And once you start doing that, and you're now setting the expectations for, here's how you should judge our success, then maybe you're going to tweak it over time and say, oh, this metric may be less important than that one. But the key thing is to like start a regular cadence of we're going to judge the success of recruiting using data. And then over time, like it also forces the data to be correct and saying like, hey, we got to work in the tools and get good data because everyone's going to see it. And so I think it's almost more important to commit to showing data than actually picking the exact right metric.
And the data takes a lot of pressure out of the situation. A big thing that happens in recruiting all the time is I don't have candidates or I don't have pipeline. If you have metrics that you can draw from it and you're in a regular cadence with the hiring manager, that actually goes out the window because you're looking at the funnel on a weekly basis and you're seeing bottlenecks and it's transparent. And so you can see that, and I use this analogy all the time, and I'm not picking on hiring managers, but we sent the hiring manager 300 candidates for review and 2 came out the other side. That's right there, a red flag that we need to have a conversation. What's going on there? And then everybody is in a place of understanding what's holding this up and what's going on. And it's not down to, hey, we don't have enough pipeline. There's a specific spot in the pipeline that we need to address. And again, it just really, it's a level of transparency that if you're being consistent with it, just gives you as a recruiter so much credibility with your hiring managers.
Which is incredibly true when we talk about diversity metrics, is that a lot of times companies, people are making excuses. Oh, it's just a top of the funnel problem. People aren't applying. And it's like, well, let's look at the actual funnel and see what's happening.
Yeah.
How come like 40% of the applicants are women and 20% of the hires are women? And like we look at the data all the time and you see it and you say like, no excuses about the top of the funnel. There's something happening in our funnel. How come this one attributed, this one interview has a totally different pass rate? And once you have the data, you can actually have a reasoned conversation around it that isn't just kind of opinions.
Yeah, what is our language in our job description not inclusive? There's just all kinds of things that you can look at when you have a real clear view at the top of the funnel. Exactly, John.
That's actually a great topic. It's around assessing candidates. We had quite a few audience questions around that as well. One of them that kind of summarizes a couple are, how do you delve into culture fit or really culture add during virtual interviews? How do you make sure that you're objectively assessing it? What have you found to be successful?
I'll start. I mean, I think the first thing is you have to define what does that mean to you? What is your culture? I think if you leave that broad and you say, hey, like go do a culture fit interview, and you're not really clear what that means, somebody's going to go and say, well, do they laugh at my jokes? Like, do we have the same kind of cultural sensibilities about things? And so in the first place you have to start is like, well, what does it mean to be successful at your company? Like, what are the values? And you have to get really clear and say, well, how would somebody demonstrate that? How do you know somebody has that? And that may sound obvious, but most companies don't have that. And so it's actually a lot of work to think through, like, well, what are the things that are really important at our company? And how would you interview for that? And who is it that's going to go do those interviews? And how have they been trained? And are we all aligned on that? So it actually takes a bunch of effort to do those interviews well.
It's a really tricky question, and it's a slippery slope in a lot of ways. And my direct answer is that at eBay, we're fortunate because we've just rolled out beliefs. And so it's important that we are infusing the beliefs, the eBay beliefs, into our interviewing cadence, and that we evaluate candidates based on the job description and who's right for the job based on their experience. And then the intangible, sort of more subtle piece is the beliefs aspect of it, and just looking at our beliefs and looking at the candidate, and is there alignment there? And did we pick up on something that maybe this isn't the right place for this person for a number of reasons that come out in the beliefs aspect of it. But I think you have to be, if you're going to talk about culture, I think you have to know what your culture is. And that's a very involved process. An employee value proposition or whatever it is. I think that culture gets thrown about when reality, I think you have to be really careful about talking about candidates being a cultural fit, unless you're grounded in something that the company has really looked at and assessed, and been honest with itself around. So it's just really tricky to get into cultural fit. I think you have to be careful there.
So last question then for both of you. Which is a lot of talent teams are in the middle of trying to prepare for next year, for 2021. What advice do you have for those teams?
You want to go first, John? Or you want me to...
I mean, yeah, sure. I think, I guess I think a lot of people will think of planning for 2021 as about like, well, what's the headcount plan? How many people do we have to add? How many backfills do we have to do? And they think of it as merely a numbers game of like, well, we're going to have to make 500 hires next year. We're going to have to make 100 hires or 20 hires, whatever it is. And I'd say like, there's working in the business and working on the business. And just focusing on those numbers is kind of working in the business. Okay, how are we going to like do all the things to make those hires? There's a separate thing, which is how are you going to mature as an org? How are you going to become awesome? How are you going to become a strategic advantage for your company? And what are the things that you're going to do differently? I would say like you can't do everything, but you can do anything. You got to pick where you're going to win there. Is it going to be about candidate experience? Is it going to be how you source? About your evaluation process? About how you close? Is it about data? But like pick the thing that you're going to get really good at, in addition to all the hires you have to make.
Yeah, exactly. I would piggyback off of that and just say that, anytime you're talking about preparing for the next year, there's the basic blocking and tackling of what you have to deliver. And then I think it's what do we want to add to what we do that we've wanted to do, and now we're going to do it. And then staging that in a short, mid, and long-term way that makes it achievable and measurable, and that you can look back at the end of the year and say, we were here and now we're here in terms of our offering and how we've grown as a recruiting organization and how we support the business. And so I think it's always great going into a new year to get really honest with yourself as a recruiting team and commit to, we're going to fundamentally make a move and change, this and this, and then map it out from simple to hard, and then just take step by step, steps forward towards it, and hold yourself accountable, on a monthly, quarterly, half yearly, yearly basis, and look back, and then rinse, repeat, and build from there. I think that's always grounding when you're talking about starting a new year, no matter what the conditions. If you put some simple things out there to work towards and really hold yourself accountable to them, I do think that you progress as an organization.
Well, thank you so much, Rick and John, for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. This concludes the thought leadership portion of this webinar. We will be sending out a recording and recap of today's session to everyone afterwards. And this was part of a monthly speaker series. So also look out for an invite to our December event. For those of you who have 5 minutes and want to stay on, I'll be doing a brief demo of Searchlight's platform with its integration with Greenhouse. Many of the things Rick and John mentioned about defining culture, intake, and onboarding are all baked into the product. So I'll go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carrie. See you, John.
So as an overview, Searchlight is the quality of hire platform that streamlines the hiring intake process to align teams on a rec success criteria up front, and then assesses candidates against those success criteria down funnel. You can think of us as bookending the ATS. And for the purpose of this demo, let's imagine that you're a talent partner helping a manager hire for a software engineering role. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. One critical piece of Searchlight, as we talked about with Rick and John today, is around intake. And so as a talent partner, you can go ahead and use Searchlight to send a hiring manager a intake kickoff survey like this that's really simple and boils down really the essence of what's important for a role. First question, like I mentioned, one thing we learned from a lot of talent leaders, it's critical to understand what's the impact a hiring manager wants to have on your team. And this is, again, a survey a hiring manager would fill out. We also have hiring managers define what would be the success criteria. And so we've defined a pretty inclusive library of attributes and competencies from IO psychologists that are predefined. And hiring managers will go in and select to them what are the most important attributes for this role. But understanding that, of course, hiring managers, a lot of times they want many different attributes. We also do ask the hard questions, which are, out of all of those criteria, what are really the must-have criteria and what are nice-to-haves? So we'll go ahead and ask those questions as well. In terms of determining culture and culture add, we know that it boils down to behaviors. So again, we work with our psychologists to create culture continuums. For this new hire to be successful, are they going to be biased towards executing quickly? Is that the culture of the team? Or are they, in this case, more motivated by solving hard problems? Are they more motivated by challenges, things like that? We can also ask for levels of mastery of certain capabilities and competencies. We've defined a list of competencies by function, benchmarked against Radford. We can also pull in customized libraries from our customers to, again, define to align on this critical success criteria for an open rec. This is something a hiring manager does async so that talent partners have the data they need to really be consultative in this search. Once a hiring manager can complete this, one of the last things that we ask is, what is the current team? And understanding that data is super important. One thing that's really makes Searchlight unique is that we can do a very lightweight 360 to model existing team members. And this gives your hiring managers data around existing behaviors, existing attributes on the team that allows them to not only think about success criteria in terms of what's already working, but also in terms of culture add. And this is something that VPs of sales and VPs of Eng really find valuable. So just continuing on, just want to do a quick overview here. When the intake survey is complete, it's surfaced as an ideal profile in Searchlight as a source of truth. And then it's time to be able to invite candidates and work with them. So we're very glad to be partners with Greenhouse. We have a one-click integration with Greenhouse. It's very simple, one-click send test through the Greenhouse UI. That's it. We'll be sending our Searchlight test to candidates. Now, how we actually assess candidates against the success criteria is pretty unique because we have a first principles approach where the best way to understand what someone's like to work with is through the people who worked with them before. But the traditional reference check process, the way that you normally get that feedback from colleagues, is pretty painful. It's manual, it slows the process down, it's extremely subjective. And so we've created a standardized, scientific, and software-driven approach to that traditional reference process. In that past colleagues are able to get a structured assessment that looks like this. It takes them 10 minutes to fill out, if that. You'll notice that they're, again, being asked very structured questions with a UX that doesn't lead the witness. It's really about where do they fall, what are observed behaviors against these competency scales. And what that leads to is that for every candidate, you're able to get a profile of who they are, and we're able to pull out their competencies and soft skills like honesty, fast learner, coachability, that normally would be difficult to get in an interview process, especially one that's virtual, as well as areas for growth like comfort with ambiguity, things like this. So strengths tags, behavioral preferences, we're able to ask behavior scores as well. This is most commonly customized to a company's values or beliefs. And of course, at the end, you have the typical open-ended text you would expect from an interview or feedback call. But most of the power comes from this data up front. And then not only that, our ability to overlay what that success criteria was over the candidate's actual profile to determine, is this candidate a great match against the success criteria that was defined during intake? Now, from this, we can actually see that Lucas is not a great match for Sam, the hiring manager's benchmark. But let's say that Sam does hire Lucas. One thing that we also do with our data to, again, help with onboarding and further down the employee lifecycle is that we have a customized onboarding guide that shows the hiring manager who this candidate's going to be, who this new hire is going to be, as well as advice for how to set them up for success. And now with remote work, we're seeing that this is more popular as a feature. All right, last thing is the power of this data over time, where it's not just using this data at the time of decision, but also how do you also have longitudinal data to be able to talk with a VP of Eng or VP of Sales as to this is the kinds of candidates you're hiring in your organization. So we're able to go into granular departmental views to say, okay, so for all the engineers that we've hired for the past year, these are the past strengths for these candidates. We're also able to compare those that were dismissed against those that were hired to see where they're different. It seems like our team prefers candidates that are more motivated by challenges, things like that. And this also gives recruiters a shared language to talk about when recruiting and closing candidates. So that was a very brief overview of Searchlight. If you're interested in learning more, just visit searchlight.ai and we'll be happy to share more information. That is the conclusion of our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us and look out for our email with the recap and recording. Have a great day.